Now, our starting point tonight, though, is South Africa, where Parliament has withdrawn an expropriation bill that it passed in 2016, which effectively allowed the government to make compulsory purchases of land to redress racial disparities in ownership. Now, the bill had not been signed into law, but it has also been, remember, overtaken by a proposal by the ruling African National Congress Party. That proposal is to change the constitution to allow the expropriation of land without any compensation. The 2016 bill was meant to enable the state to pay for land at a value that will be determined by a government adjudicator and then expropriate it for the public interest. Now, South Africans have been taking part in ongoing public hearings about land reform, and these have been held right across the country. All right, then, so let's explore this in more detail with CGTN's Sumitra Naidu. She's live in Johannesburg right now. Sumitra, walk us through the context here. Given that this bill was passed by legislators back in 2016, why was it never assented to back then?
Well, that's right, Rama. The bill was passed by the National Assembly in 2016, but it was never signed into law by then President Jacob Zuma, so it never became an act. There were several objections to the bill at the time. The opposition Democratic Alliance complained that the bill was unconstitutional. It also wasn't completely satisfied with how the bill was drafted, with the, making claims that it didn't follow the proper procedures. Private research institutions also urged the president not to sign. They were very concerned about the bill in its current form. The agricultural unions were also not in favor of the bill because it stated that land would be expropriated for public use, for widening roads, building public facilities and so forth. So the bill was then sent back to Parliament, and that's pretty much where it stayed.
Indeed. So this bill is drafted, essentially proposed that a government adjudicator would sit down and decide how much land is worth before it would be bought out then by the state. Is this an idea that might make a comeback in the current debate about land reform?
So I do think that there would be land evaluations, but definitely not for compensation. So I think that that's exactly why this bill has been withdrawn, because of the new proposed policy. It doesn't make any provisions for compensation. The bill in its current form is still based on compensation and basically sets out all the details on how this compensation must be made, from land valuations to assessments and current use of property, taking into consideration the amount of investment that's been made on the property over how many years, right down to the time and manner of how payment must be made. Now, the bill is being taken back so that it can be redrafted to affect the changes in line with the new land policy, which will allow for expropriation without compensation. The Constitutional Review Committee is, of course, still busy with its public hearings into the proposed policy. Once that's complete, it will offer more guidance in drawing up and amending the new bill.
Indeed, but let's look at history, though. South Africa's tried at least 3 different approaches to actually deal with this land reform issue. In the 90s, government was providing grants and subsidies to buy plots. Under Thabo Mbeki as president, they were helping individuals buy up large-scale farms. And of course, when Jacob Zuma was president, the state was buying land outright and then redistributing it. So why did all these 3 approaches fail?
Well, Rama, I don't think the former approaches failed completely. Some did work. There is evidence on the ground, even today, of where people got their land back and are still living on it and are starting to work that land. The problem, though, was exactly as you say. There wasn't, this scale of results. There were not many of these cases. Land reform, is extremely complex when you actually get down to it. And because land was taken away so many decades ago by the apartheid government in the hostile manner that it did it, the Land Act took effect in 1913. So even tracing original deeds and histories of the original owners is quite a grueling task. Capacity and the skill to implement the policies is an issue on its own. But I think the bigger issue is that it was so expensive for the government. For a new democratic dispensation, land reform started back in 1994. That had to start from scratch, this was still a reviving an economy, attempts to revive this economy. It was barely functioning because of sanctions. So at that time, the willing buyer, willing seller policy applied, and that was really expensive. It was a huge cost for the government to pay out farmers to leave that land. And then there was the issue of post-settlement support for people that you were giving the land to. So once the government bought the land back from white farmers and gave it back to black farmers or to communities, there was no money or capital also accompanying that. So you have a situation where you have the land back, existing farms that are not being maintained because it's expensive. There's no money. You have that land, you have that farm, but you have no money to actually work it. And then you have to start from scratch. And by that, going out and finding the capital first. Also, in many cases, people that could prove that their land was taken away chose to take a monetary settlement instead of the land. Brahma?
Indeed. One last question for you, Sumitra. And I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but let's say for argument's sake, right, the state repossesses several thousand hectares of land with or without compensation, however it happens. What happens after that? How would land redistribution take place? How do the states get to determine who should and who should not benefit?
Well, Rama, I think this is what's creating so much uncertainty and uneasiness. The ANC is still working on new policy on how exactly this will work. So it's made certain to let everyone know that it's not backing down. It's going ahead with expropriation without compensation. It's made itself very clear that this is important. Land reform has to go ahead. And of course, you know, I think there is a consensus that land reform has to be fast-tracked. It's been, you know, many years since we entered this democratic dispensation. You know, and even though it doesn't, you know, it doesn't need to really amend the constitution, the ANC wants to do that too. But the finer detail on which land will be earmarked for expropriation, whether it's only agricultural land that will be taken, will there be post-settlement support for new farmers, or more accessible, affordable financing, no one actually knows for sure. There's also uncertainty on whether everything will go back to the state and then be redistributed or re-administered on 99-year leases, as is the practice in some other countries. I think that's still the big burning question right now, and that's what's making investors nervous, South Africans, to everybody around the world really, is just to see how all of this is going to unfold. We're really still waiting to hear from the ANC.
Indeed, of course, we'll keep a very close eye on that story. Sumitra Naidu, live in Johannesburg. Thank you.